All right. Do you have your cup of coffee or your cup of tea? We are going to discuss the pink part of my chart. So, I've seen several people leave discordant comments on the social media accounts of influencers or people of influence who were standing in solidarity with Palestine, and they were telling them that they should mind their own business, or that they should, fix the mess in Lebanon before looking at the mess of other countries, or look at the occupation happening in Lebanon instead of the occupation happening in Palestine. And I'm here to address that. So, for the record, I would like to state that I'm not talking about the contending comments that were addressed to politicians or government officials whose condemnation of Israel in the name of human rights is awfully hypocritical. And I'll give you an example. I actually read a clever comment accusing a Lebanese politician of being two-faced about his human rights imploration because that same politician sided with the Syrian regime, which shelled Lebanon for years and destroyed Aleppo, Homs, Hama, killing more than 250,000 Syrians, displacing 12 million Syrians, including 2 million who took refuge in Lebanon, that same politician complains about and wants to return to Syria. Yet that politician never implored mercy for the Syrian people the way that he's imploring mercy for the Palestinians. So the commenter's conclusion, hey buddy, focus on your country, to that specific politician or anyone who's like him, I get it. In fact, calling out the duplicity of that politician or really any person of influence is justified, maybe more than justified, and is definitely in its place. But I'm not talking about that type of comment addressed to duplicitous politicians. I'm talking about the contending comments that were addressed to Good Samaritans who were showing empathy and solidarity with the Palestinians, and I am here to address that. Now, it is no secret that people are under extreme pressure due to our really awful situation in Lebanon, and such situations often exacerbate unresolved issues. So let's say things as they are. I believe part of the discourse of, focus on your problems instead of focusing on Palestinian problems has less to do with being Lebanon-centric and more to do with people's historic fatigue related to the Palestinian cause, and more specifically, some people's active resentment of the Palestinian cause, its upshots, but especially its defenders or its militia defenders specifically. Now, I'm not here to give any qualitative assessment of that resentment or whether that resentment has its place in our discourse or not, but it is important to remind ourselves that some people, or maybe many people in Lebanon, do have a historic contempt towards Palestinians and or a residual trauma from the days where the Lebanese people were bloodily divided and betrayed each other along the lines of Palestine and Israel, and all at the expense of tremendous trauma that was never corrected. And this caused a deep, unhealed rift between the Lebanese people. And while this rift was certainly not created by the Palestinians, for let's face it, it was really there since the beginning, but the rift was precipitated by the issue of Palestine and Israel, and thus it diverged the Lebanese people's subsequent loyalties and people's emotionality. Now, those loyalties are still conflicting to this day, and that's a very important part to understand if our quest is to, do healthy nation building, because that same rift has been remodeled and adapted today by the Lebanese political mafia and their militia sponsor, of course, Hezbollah, to cause refreshed resentment amongst the Lebanese. And that is what's transpiring through some of those aggrieved comments, in my opinion. Now, another thing that transpired is the idea that if we as a country are unwell, which we are, we cannot make others well. Thus, we need to look after ourselves first and not waste our precious energy on Palestine, and we must focus solely on Lebanon. And I obviously agree that if one feels unwell, then they must do their utmost to get themselves to be well again. And I do also agree that Lebanon is absolutely in need of devotion from its people to get back on its feet. But I don't really see how a solidarity post against ethnic cleansing occurring next door will stand in the way of us becoming well as a nation. How am I dispersing my precious resources that should go to Lebanon by posting my support for Palestine against ethnic cleansing? I mean, let's be honest, we do not lose any focus on our own country issues by standing up against the unfathomable persecution of human beings outside of our borders. That's just not how it works. I do not lose focus of the Lebanese colossal corruption problem if I'm outraged by the deforestation of the Amazon. I do not lose focus of the 90% devaluation of the Lebanese lira if I root for indigenous people's rights in the USA. I do not lose focus of the billions of dollars that are missing from our deposits if I stand against the environmental holocaust of our oceans worldwide. In fact, I believe it's the opposite. It is proven that practicing empathy makes us better citizens in our own country. Practicing compassion makes us a better human being in general. And really, we need to populate our countries with better humans. And there is no betterment without empathy. So if anything, to be true Lebanese patriots, we need to show more empathy for each other and for others. Now, furthermore, if it was a true, focus on your country sort of plea or stance in an analytical sense, then we would have probably seen a lot more pushback from people against the horde of the Je suis Charlie posts and the Black Lives Matter posts and the Save Notre Dame de Paris posts, which in essence were also emotional solidarity stances with painful foreign issues, exactly like the Palestine posts this week. But, no one really said focus on Lebanese problems instead of focusing on French and American problems. There was no pushback. And the reason there was no pushback has to do purely with politics, the current political climate revolving around Hezbollah. And that is what I will discuss for the rest of this conversation. Now, many people who were pushing back against the solidarity post of Palestine did it by repurposing these Palestine solidarity posts to shove Hezbollah and Iran's occupation of Lebanon. After all, Hezbollah has crowned itself as the archetypal fighter of the Palestinian cause in Lebanon and controls all anti-Israeli posturing. Thus, some people's instinct is to rebuff the Palestinian cause and rebuff anti-Israeli posturing, because by doing so, they're essentially rebuffing Hezbollah's claimed raison d'être, which is literally weapons for the protection of Lebanon from Israel. So if we rebuff empathizing with the Palestinians and we downplay the chokehold Israel has on Palestine because we want to make sure people remained agitated about the chokehold that Iran has on Lebanon today, maybe we will be better off. But I am here to make the case that with this strategy, you will create the absolute contradictory effect, for reality lies in exactly the opposite direction. Yes, by rebuffing the Palestinian cause, using that angle, you give more power and stability to Hezbollah amongst the many layers of their now shaky base. Because the question of Israel is a very centric and painful one, and you won't be addressing the pain through that narrative. Now, allow me, please, to make the case for that point. Israel is an extremely emotional and existential issue for many, many, many Lebanese people, whether or not we like it. Not sharing these people's opinion is one thing, but discounting their opinion is another thing. You are free to disagree, but you cannot coerce their opinion into silence. Strategically speaking, you cannot even ignore it or downplay it. The road to Lebanon's liberation is paved on moral consistency. Ethics dictates consistency, meaning our moral actions, our standards, our values should not be paradoxical. Examining our politics today will reveal plenty of moral contradictions, but adjusting our moral standards and behaviors to make them consistent is an integral part of our national development. And today, there is no moral consistency in our quest for freedom and justice because our story is being told by extremists who are deeply immoral. Turn on the TV. Whose sound bites are they reporting? Yours and mine, or the extremists? Think about it for a second. What do you stand for? What do we stand for? Liberty, honesty, rule of law, transparency, justice, human rights? How will we fight for those values if the main narrative for justice and liberty is being told by the extremists? There is no battle for those values that can ever be won if you are not the one telling our main story of liberation. And today we are not telling the story. Iran, Israel, and their extremist allies are telling our story. Thus, it is absolutely imperative that the regional narrative be taken back, not only internally, but also externally, from the claws of all extremist groups and repositioned on morality. The future of our country and the entire region depends on our success in demoting the fanatical, bigoted, supremacy-driven narratives of the colonial and imperial powers who have impeded Lebanon's liberty for too long and replacing their bigoted narratives with our humane, secular, freedom-loving, humanitarian, equality-rooted, justice-ingrained, compassion-driven narrative that actively condemns all narcissistic psychopathic powers.